The first theory that we're going to deal with is a consequentialist theory, and it's one called ethical egoism. Essentially, ethical egoism is where the ethics of a particular act is based upon whether it's good for you or not good for you. The ethical thing to do is what furthers your personal interest. So we don't look at other people, it's about how the act affects you. Why don't we get into it with a bit more detail, thinking about what it actually means and also the possible limitations or criticisms of this particular approach. So as I was just outlining, ethical egoism says that the right action, or what is the good thing to do, is something which maximizes your own good. So to do that, you need to think about what's going to happen as a result of different possible actions. So, should I lie or not? Okay, so we have to look at what's the consequence of lying and what's the consequence of not lying. When we look at those consequences, we're looking at the consequences for the person who we're asking the question about. So if it's about me, should I lie or not, then I need to look at the consequences to me of lying or not lying. And the particular course of action that I should take is the one that results in the more positive consequences for me. That's why it's a consequentialist theory. In fact, it's beyond that's what I should do. You've got to think about it this way. If you believe in ethical egoism, you are morally obliged to do that. Okay, it would be morally wrong not to lie if lying led to the greatest positive consequences for me. Now, some of the misconceptions that can occur with ethical egoism are if we just take a shallow view of what our self-benefit is. Ethical egoism actually doesn't make any prescription as to what the pleasure or what the good is for you that needs to be maximized. It could be physical pleasure, but it also could be your long-term interest, which might mean, for instance, that you decide to exercise, which might for you feel painful in the short term, but have a long-term consequence. Okay? So it's not necessarily exactly the same as just doing what's pleasurable in the moment. Also, we note that ethical egoism doesn't mean that you should never cooperate. It just means that you choose to cooperate when it helps your own interest. Okay, and that could be in many situations that you cooperate or are honest, because in the long run, that will be in your own self-interest. So someone can be an ethical egoist and also they can be honest and trustworthy. But they will only be honest and trustworthy so far as it benefits the person involved. And as I was saying before, it doesn't mean that you take the easy option. You can in fact make those sacrifices as long as it's in your long-term interest. So ethical egoism does have some positives about it, right? It reflects the idea that we as individuals are important and that we probably know best what's good for us. So therefore, acting in our own self-interest is a good thing to do. We note also that we've already defined that it doesn't mean that you just act selfishly all the time. You can lead to this cooperative behaviour. Now, I'm sure that you've guessed by now that there are some problems with ethical egoism. Perhaps one of the most telling problems of ethical egoism is that it really appears to conflict with what morality and ethics is about. Remember from last week we talked that ethics really is about the relationship between what is good, the self, and others. Well, ethical egoism actually ignores others. It really just concentrates on oneself. And so many people would argue that it's really not a valid, a truly valid moral position to take. That's because it's a partial or a biased approach to ethics because it prioritizes yourself over everyone else. We can see that that comes through when we think about particular acts where most people would subscribe that some acts or or some states of being are actually unethical. So we could say that, say, accepting slavery, right? Accepting slavery could be good for you as long as you're not the slave. But many people, I think most people, would accept that slavery is an unethical state and that we shouldn't be involved in decisions around slavery or taking part in slavery. If we do accept ethical egoism, one of the implications is that really morality is again subjective. By that we're saying the morality changes, that what is morally right changes individual by individual as to what they value or like or desire, what will be in their interests. Now, if we take that position, we end back at a position of ethical relativism that we talked about last week, which means that there's no absolute rule for what's right. And again, there are a lot of problems that arise from that. We can actually argue that we're not subject to criticism, that we can't self-improve, and we can't even think about our own morals as being wrong if it is that subjective. So ethical egoism, I think, is subject to a lot of problems and a lot of criticisms as an ethical framework. Ethical egoism is often justified on the basis of psychological egoism. So psychological egoism is really a descriptive theory that looks at what people actually do, and it would suggest that most people are set up to be self-interested. That's the way we've been programmed, etc. Again, there's several criticisms of this. Perhaps the main one is that there are a lot of people who sacrifice quite a lot that you can't really conceivably be arguing is in their own interests. I mean, ethical egoists will still argue it is in their interests, but to do so, they really almost need to be taking part in a tautology, right? They're really making the argument fit. So for instance, a stranger who goes and risks their own life to rescue someone else. You know, what can be the justification that it's in their interest to risk their life, perhaps even die, rescuing someone they don't know? An ethical egoist can argue that they were seeking glory and being a hero, etc., and that's what really motivated them. But if we end up there, the argument actually becomes circular, and in that way it becomes illogical. It is a classic tautology, and therefore is not a good argument. So that's the first of our theories, ethical egoism. It's the idea that what is morally right to do is the thing that furthers your own personal interests. There are some misconceptions about that. There are a couple of positives there, that it does value the person and put you in the position of knowing what's best for you. But we've also seen that there's a lot of problems when the only consequences we look at are how it positively or negatively affects us, and that becomes the thing that we make the decision on. It questions whether it is actually a valid moral theory, as it ignores the other in that relationship between good, self, and other. So to think about the other, we're going to look in our next little video at utilitarianism, which takes the idea of pleasure or goodness and extends it beyond the person making the decision to everyone affected by the decision.